Hi guys, I'm John Green, and this is Crash Course Art. Oh man, I don't know what the fuck just came over me. Sorry about that, guys. Anyways, a while ago, I was having a heartfelt conversation with a friend, and I asked her what she struggled most with in art. She replied, shading. And I thought that was pretty fair, especially with global warming becoming a serious concern. In that same vein, I saw this post originally by the art mom trademarked about shading. Now, the art mom trademarked isn't wrong. These shadow colors would look nice, but I do have some reservations about it. Some beef, if you will. Not only is this a little bit limiting towards the types of scenes and moods you can portray, since the mood of a scene depends greatly on the lighting, but it also makes it seem like there isn't really much of a reason why you would shade things with certain colors, other than it looks good. Of course, no shade to this person specifically. I'm sure this post was helpful to a lot of people, but I'd like to build on it. So I decided to start this video series, which will give you a shading crash course. The first part of the series, with an emphasis on color, will be split into two parts, since the last video I did was super long, and it was an absolute nightmare. So keep your eyes peeled for the next installments of this series, I guess. And to get this out of the way and avoid looking like a hypocrite, what I'm going to be telling you is going to be pretty oversimplified, so I encourage you all to do your own supplementary research. This first part is going to be mainly about the basics of shading and how light affects color. The next part will talk more about color stylization, general tips, and, well, I'm not sure what else yet. But you can bet I'll do everything in my power to make it at least 10 minutes long, so I can get that sweet, sweet money. But before we can get ahead of ourselves, let's run through the basics real quick. This might be common knowledge for most of you, but bear with me, because this is a good foundation for what I'll be covering in the rest of the series. And since there's more content coming, make sure to like and subscribe. Oh shit, I said the thing. I finally made it. I'm a real Alright, this is a color wheel. Do you have it memorized? No. Well, hurry up and memorize it. Okay, that's enough memorizing. There are three parts that make up a color: hue, saturation, and value. You can change a color into any other color by changing any of these aspects. If colors are directly across from each other, they're complementary. This is the easiest and most important one to remember. If they're right next to each other on the color wheel, they're analogous colors. If they're in this formation, it's a split complementary color scheme. If you only use one of these colors in differing values, that's a monochromatic color scheme. And at this point, I'm just reading off this image I found on Google. Still, there are more color schemes, but these are the main ones. This is important because these colors are almost universally agreed to look good together. If you have trouble finding colors that look good together by instinct alone, this might be helpful. And this is probably where the art mom trademarked was coming from when that list was written. She was using color theory, and it's effective. It's a good jumping off point, but we can still go deeper. But that aside, it's important to keep in mind that there are two ways to transition from colors across a color wheel: the long way and the short way. The long way involves going through all the colors separating the hues, while the short way involves going through gray. Later on, I'll explain this a little bit more and how you can apply this to shading. Lastly, onto something that's a little more weird. People often say that certain colors reflect certain moods, concepts, or feelings. I'm sure we've all heard this stuff once in our lives. I'm gonna tell you right now that as a whole, I think it's a little bit stupid, at least for illustration purposes. In most cases, I would say not to worry about it at all, except in certain scenarios. In my opinion, it's mostly the value and saturation of your shadow and highlight colors that do the heavy lifting when it comes to mood. Now that we have that out of the way, it's probably a good idea to establish how light works in the real world. When I was a young artist starting out, I always thought how light worked was pretty simple, and the way I shaded was passable. But it wasn't until recently that I actually started to care about the little nuances of it. Just remember, this knowledge is the most effective when you actually understand the form of what you're shading. If you have absolutely no idea what the object looks like in 3D, then you're out of luck. It's time to brush up on your drawing fundamentals. But in lazy man's terms, just use a reference. But anyways, we've reached about the middle of the video, so it's time for our mid-show break for ads.
Who's that Pokemon?
This ball everyone's damn tired of seeing. Wait a minute. Ugh, what the fuck is this? This is an absolute monstrosity. My editor's getting fired. But to run it down quickly, the darkest part of the ball is the core shadow, where the least amount of light is touching the ball. I've heard that a good way to quantify it is halfway to black, from the local value. Though that can change depending on the scenario. The shadow the ball casts on the floor is the drop shadow, or cast shadow. The part of the ball where the most light is touching is called the highlight. The ball's mid-tone, which happens where there's less light hitting it than the most highlighted bit, but a little bit more light hitting it than the darkest shadow. Some would say it's how the object looks in its natural state, or in normal lighting conditions. But not only is that not necessarily true, it's also impossible to quantify. In my opinion, it really just is the transition shade. But don't think that just because it's the value midpoint from the highlight to the shadows, that its saturation and hue have to be in between those two colors too. More on that later. Now, something that people may not know, at least not consciously, is the existence of ambient occlusion and reflected light, also known as bounce light or ambient light. If you're a painter, these are pretty crucial. Basically, they're this. Bounce light is a light that hits the object, not from the main light source directly, but from when that light bounces off the objects around that object and hits the object in question. I'm so good with words, guys. Of course, a lot of examples in the real world are much more subtle than this, and you can play it up as little or as much as you like. As a real example, here's my hand. It seems that, even in pictures without my face, I'm awkward as hell. I amaze myself more each day. Anyways, you can clearly see the main highlight on my hand from the sunlight, and a little bit of the local color of my hand. Everything else is in shadow, and as you can see, the shadow colors are more desaturated than my hand's local color, since the environment around me is a desaturated color. You can even see that the reverse is true for the wall. The shadow my hand casts on the wall is a lot more saturated than the wall's local color, because light is bouncing off my hand and hitting that area of the wall. Now, that's all pretty subtle, but there's also this bounce light, which is less subtle, but is the most intense in these specific areas because those specific planes of my hand are facing this ledge, which is getting a lot of light. It's through this ambient light that causes color variation in your shadows, where your light source does not directly touch. Because of this, your midtone may not always be between your highlights and shadows in terms of hue and saturation. As for ambient occlusion, it's the exclusion of ambient light, or basically the idea that shadows can have different values depending on how little light hits it. It's basically the darkest shadows, usually in some sort of crevice, in which bounce light or ambient light isn't able to hit, or at least not as much. In the case of my hand, it would be here, between my fingers. It's a really simple premise, but you'd be surprised at how many beginners forget to capitalize on it. Really, ambient occlusion can be the difference between a good rendering and a great one, as it brings depth to an image. Still, there's one last thing that's good to know, which is subsurface scattering. You've definitely seen this before. This happens in thin objects, like paper, thin fabric, fingers, or even toes, if you're into that. Since they're so thin, light is able to penetrate through these objects more than usual, and as a result, you're able to see a lot of that light, of course, partially influenced by the color of the object itself. The most novel and useful application of this is when you're rendering the ears of a character, particularly in strong, warm light, like sunlight. In these cases, the thinnest parts of the ears start turning red, or even yellow if the light source is strong enough. But to be honest, other than this, it doesn't come up often, so I wouldn't worry too much about it. But to sum up, the way you shade an object, in terms of color, disregarding value for a second, depends on three things: the local color of that object, the color of the light source, and the color of the objects around it. Now that we have that out of the way, it's time for a sacrificial reference breakdown. To see all this stuff in a more natural setting. Now, don't get me wrong, I love balls, but they're not exactly what I'd call a mundane, you'd see this shit out in the wild kind of scenario. Thus, in comes our reference. This is for research. Definitely for research purposes only. But ultimately, this is my channel, and I get to choose the reference. Anyways, I think this is a pretty good example of interesting ambient light, and also a little bit of subsurface scattering in the shirt. But of all the things that happened in this music video, that's probably the last thing someone is going to notice. But back to the point. You can see the main light coming from the top left corner, and a lot of ambient light coming from the bottom right. Again, that ambient light is the most prevalent in the planes of the face perpendicular to that light source. To really bring that point home, we can use 2D squares. I'm showing 5 scenarios, each with a light source, a 2D plane, and an object behind it, which will give us some bounce light. In each scenario, the 2D plane is angled differently. Guess in which scenario the pink side is going to be getting the most and least light. Okay, time's up. You're wrong. Here's the order from most light to least. Just remember that once a plane is directly parallel to a light source, and beyond, the only light it'll be getting is bounce light. Of course, bounce light is from everywhere, and so for simplicity's sake, I would really just focus on the most relevant source of bounce light for whatever you're trying to render, and only render it where the main light source doesn't directly touch. A way you can apply this idea to planes of the human face, and also strengthen your understanding of it, is by studying the Zorro head, which I guess I'll demonstrate now. Sorry, 10. You were good to me. And yes, I made him bald. For science. But the Zorro head really is perfect for studying planes, and you can do so by drawing this head from reference, drawing it from memory, and even by drawing it onto a reference photo by memory or reference. Of course, the angularity of the face is exaggerated, but it can be really helpful for understanding how to shade the face, especially in what planes protrude / will be struck by light, etc. But while we're on this, something I'd like to point out is how chunky the highlights caused by the main light source are. Even though it's blended, there are some clear shapes you can see, which is key in defining form. When painting faces, I see a lot of beginners just too afraid to use these shapes, instead opting for diffused light, which lets them get away with being less decisive. In some scenarios, that can work, but in a lot of cases, especially with beginners, it makes the painting look muddy. In the picture, if you color pick this guy's skin, you'll see colors that you wouldn't normally associate with skin, and yet it looks completely natural. Why? Context, bitch. You can see how the tone of the shadows on his skin match the warmth of the background, which make it look more cohesive, and it makes it look like this guy really belongs in the environment he's in. The point I'm getting at is that you don't have to be so literal with your colors, like picking bright green for grass, or a super peachy, high-keyed color for skin, because it all just depends on context, like the lighting conditions and the objects around them. And this brings me to one of the main pros of transitioning from color to color by passing through gray, as mentioned earlier. It's good because it's very naturalistic looking. If you look at our reference, the transition from cool light to warm shadow is through grays. This is also how you can combine the color theory aspect of color and the more technical lighting aspect of color. There will be times in real life and in art where your colors don't look good, even if you're following color theory. In those times, desaturating those colors is often the answer. However, too much unvarying gray can also be bland, which is where the long way of transitioning comes in handy. But largely, it'll be up to you to decide when to use each method. Anyways, with all that stuff, this video's become less like a shading tutorial and more into rendering territory. And yeah, this video was pretty much set from the get-go to get derailed pretty quickly. But either way, hopefully this was helpful to you guys. If not, there are some videos from other YouTubers linked in the description, which will hopefully do something for you. Regardless, I've been talking for long enough. I want to hear your opinions now. Was this helpful? Are you excited for part 2? You better fucking be. Should I make more K-pop idols bald for science? Was this 10 minutes of your time wasted? On second thought, don't answer that last one. It'll hurt my feelings. But for the other stuff, let me know down in the comments. TLDR, lighting is king, color is an illusion, life is a lie, God is dead, and you're adopted. And also, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.